It can be that the right which lay in wait is not present in its own proper shape to the consciousness of the doer, but is present only implicitly in the inner guilt of the resolve and the action. But the ethical consciousness is more complete, its guilt more inexcusable, if it knows beforehand the law and the power which it opposes, if it takes them to be violence and wrong, to be ethical merely by accident, and, like Antigone, knowingly commits the crime. The accomplished deed completely alters its point of view. The very performance of it declares that what is ethical must be actual, for the realization of the purpose is the purpose of the action. Doing directly expresses the unity of actuality and substance. It declares that actuality is not an accident of essence, but that in union with essence it is not granted to any right that is not a true right. The ethical consciousness must, on account of this actuality and on account of its deed, acknowledge its opposite as its own actuality, must acknowledge its guilt. Because we suffer, we acknowledge we have erred. In paragraph 470, Hegel explicitly references Sophocles' play The Antigone, and he's going to bring up the character by name. He's also going to end this particular passage with a line from the Antigone: because we suffer, we acknowledge we have erred. And you might read that and say, oh, okay, well that's just a typical pithy line about got to learn from the school of hard knocks, or there's some things that you can't learn from books, you need to learn on the streets or experientially, or however we want to think about it. But what is going on here is not just any sort of learning. It's really, we could call this a learning of ethical catastrophe, if we wanted to coin another phrase. What is going to be happening in this paragraph and then the paragraphs to follow, tracing back to the previous paragraph, is the working out of what Hegel has talked about as guilt or Schuld. And why does the doer, the ethical actor, bear guilt in the very attempt to be ethical, to do ethics in a substantive way? That is what we're working with here. And Hegel is giving us, once again, this is kind of a linchpin moment, a turning point where we're going to see things coming together. He's making a contrast here as well that's very important. I've put these numbers here, number 1 and number 2, two different ways in which the doer, that's how Miller is translating handelnde Bewusstsein, right? The consciousness that is acting, the consciousness that is comporting itself, the consciousness that is doing some purposive action. How does this play itself out? There is guilt involved. We saw that already in the previous paragraph through the very action, through the very deed, through the very resolution, the Entschluss, as we saw. Now, how does that guilt manifest itself? It's not just going to be individualized. He's going to talk about that at first in terms of something like an unconscious guilt. But it's going to be, as I said, a kind of catastrophe that engulfs the entire domain of the ethical in the paragraphs yet to come. Here it's just primarily about one side. So he says it can be that the right which lay in wait, what is the right that lay in wait? The other law. The law that one construes, whether it be the human law or the divine law, as entirely lacking in any sort of legitimacy, any sort of recht, justice, any sort of embodiment of ethics. So he goes on and he says, it can be that the right which lay in wait is not present in its own proper shape to the consciousness of the doer. So it can be that in the case of some doers, that they're not conscious that they're transgressing another law. They're not conscious they're transgressing another power, another, you might say, spiritual, in the sense that Hegel's using a geistige entity that has its claims not only upon us, but upon the whole social sphere that we participate in, the sphere of spirit. What's the case in that situation? Hegel goes on and he says it's present only implicitly in the inner guilt of the resolve and the action. So a person feels guilt. They're not quite sure exactly what's going on. Something has been transgressed. In the terms of the plays, not just Sophocles' Antigone, but tracing back to Oedipus as well, and then looking ahead to the other Oedipus play, it could be that the character grasps there's something wrong, something afoot, but doesn't have the ways of articulating it yet in terms of these laws. Now, in the other way, the way that's going to take us forward that Hegel talks about, he's talking here about the ethical consciousness. He says the ethical consciousness is more complete and its guilt more inexcusable if it deliberately sets itself up in opposition to the other law or the other power. Hegel uses Macht here as well. And this is exactly what Hegel takes Antigone to be doing. We saw in the previous paragraph, and this has been hinted at quite a bit in the paragraphs before that why there's this conflict in this way at this stage is that the acting person who's acting on behalf of one of the laws, one of the ethical powers, treats the other one as if it has no validity whatsoever. As Hegel's going to say in just a few moments, as if the other law is ethical merely by accident. And we'll get into the implications of that in a moment. So Antigone does this. If we look at Sophocles' play, which you should not rob yourself of the opportunity to read and reread, especially when looking at this section, what you're going to discover is that Creon and the other people as well are going to attempt to make arguments to Antigone, and they're also going to make threats. Antigone is following a sacred duty, and that duty is one which embodies the divine law. We saw much earlier that one of the key things in the divine law is to give the proper rights to the dead. Now, she has several brothers, two of whom who have just died, one defending the city, the other one attacking the city with the aid of some allies brought in. And the one who is attacking the city is viewed as a traitor. Now, in the paragraphs coming up ahead, we're going to get a little bit of the backstory of this. But right now, what's important is that from the perspective of the human law, the one brother is going to be acknowledged as legitimate. His sacrifice matters. The other brother is going to be acknowledged as a traitor, as an alien, as a foreigner, somebody who attacked the city from the outside, who does not get the proper burial rights. Antigone feels that she must do this for her brother. And there's a lot of discussions we could have of Greek conceptions of death and funerary rites. What matters here is that she is his sister. She's equally his sister as she is to the brother who the human law is taking care of. So she is embodying the divine law in contrast to the human law. The human law is declared nobody shall bury these dead. They shall be laid out there to rot, to be eaten by the dogs, the birds of the air, which for the Greeks was a terrible thing. She goes out there and she pours dirt upon him to, at least give some symbolic covering of the earth and thereby allow his shade to be set at rest. And this is viewed as something that she ought to do. She ought to do it not by the human law, which has already forbidden it, but by the divine law, which trumps the human law. In doing this, she is deliberately transgressing the human law and saying, your human law is wrong. It's not really ethical. It is violence. It is wrong. It's the opposite of right or justice. So Hegel goes on here, and he says, if it knows beforehand the law and the power which it opposes, if it takes them to be violence and wrong, to be ethical merely by accident, and like Antigone, knowingly commits the crime. The deed is a crime from the perspective of human law, a deed from the perspective, indeed a duty from the perspective of divine law. So we have a conflict here again. And Hegel goes on, and here's where we get the really interesting twist. It It's not just going to be, well, you've got an opposition of laws and this tragic circumstances. No, what's going to happen is this is going to undermine both laws. He says the accomplished deed completely alters its point of view once it's done. The very performance of it declares that what is ethical must be actual. So this is you might say, guiding, I don't want to call it presupposition, let's call it a performative assumption that is built into action. When you act, you are acting as a conscious being, as a doer, in such a way as to be asserting that what you're doing ought to be done. So what does that mean? Hegel frames this in terms of the ethical must be actual. It's not just enough to have nice, flowery ideas in your head and intentions and all that. You actually have to do something. If you want to be ethical, if you want the ethical to be ethical, it must be made actual. Let's use another example. You say that you love somebody. This is one that Sartre himself uses much later on. If you say that you love somebody, but you don't actually do anything loving towards them, you don't love them. You may tell yourself that you love them, but the ethical content of love, it has its expression in action and actuality, in changing circumstances, in making things happen, in continuing making things happen. So in this case, Antigone is acting. So here we go. The very performance of it declares what is ethical must be actual. This is understood in a universal way. The realization of the purpose is the purpose of the action. The realization of the end, the intention, is the action and its realization. Otherwise, again, don't talk about it and say you have an intention if you're never going to act on it. It's not an intention. It's a whim. It's a wish. It's something else instead. So, if we broaden this, then Hegel says doing directly expresses the unity of actuality and substance. And we're talking here about ethical substance and its actuality. So, what does that mean? Does that the doing thereby not become a crime, not transgress the law? No. Here we go. It declares that actuality is not an accident of essence, but that in union with essence, it is not granted to any right that is not a true right. Or, if we like, justice, or ought, or however we want to express it. And he goes on and says, the ethical consciousness must, on account of this actuality and on account of its deed, acknowledge its opposite as its own actuality, must acknowledge its guilt. So what is happening here? There's, you might say, two stages. In the deed, as it is being done, as it is being planned, as it is being talked about, there is the treatment of the other law as nullified, as being ethical only by accident. They happen to be the people in charge. They're making up the rules. I guess it would be the right thing to follow them, but the divine law says otherwise, so I'm going to follow the divine law in these circumstances. What is implicitly built into this very way of acting and thinking, the consciousness involved, is that the ethical must become actual. In doing so, it does not completely nullify the other law, because the other law also expresses the ethical. And not merely by accident, the ethical has to be essential, or it's not ethical. So, what are we confronted by here? This is why guilt occurs within this circumstance as well. Now we come back to this great sentence, because we suffer, we acknowledge we have erred. The suffering occurs because this other law is not completely abrogated or nullified. And part of the suffering is actually the guilt, telling you, you acted, and you acted on, what you felt was right, the best understanding you had of the ethical. It turned out that the ethical encompasses more than you thought, including what you thought went against the ethical. So this is a really serious problematic here, which is now going to be dealt with in the subsequent paragraphs. With this acknowledgement, there is no longer any conflict between ethical purpose and actuality. It signifies the return to an ethical frame of mind, which knows that nothing counts but right. But the doer thereby surrenders his own character and the reality of his self and has been ruined. His being consists in his belonging to his ethical law as his substance. In acknowledging the opposite law, the other ceases to be for him his substance, and instead of attaining actuality, it has become an unreality, a sentiment, or disposition. The substance does appear, it is true, in the individuality as his pathos, and the individuality appears as that which animates the substance and hence stands above it. But the substance is a pathos that is at the same time his character. The ethical individuality is directly and intrinsically one with this, his universal aspect, exists in it alone, and is incapable of surviving the destruction of this ethical power by its opposite. Here in paragraph 471, Hegel is now going to sketch out for us what somebody like Antigone in Sophocles' play by the same name is doing that is going to lead not only to their own ruin, but to the ruin of the ethical as it's been conceived as such. And how is this going to take place? Think about it for a moment. The triumph of the ethical was through the deed, for the person acting on behalf of one of these two ethical powers or ethical laws, the law of the family or the law of the community, the human law, acting against the other law in a point of conflict, nullifying that, but then it turns out that that can't really be nullified. It has a much greater staying power. It's going to turn out here in this section that what aligning oneself with the ethical in a wholehearted way was supposed to provide to the individual falls out from under them, and they are left with just their own individuality. This is another way of expressing what Hegel was talking about earlier in talking about the deed as being inevitably a sort of crime. So, Hegel goes on. He says, with this acknowledgement, now there's a lot of German verbiage here that I want to actually go over because the Miller translation, although it's really great in many respects, loses the thread a little bit here. He says, with this acknowledgement, there is no longer any conflict between ethical purpose and actuality. It signifies the return to an ethical frame of mind, which knows that nothing counts but right. So let's talk about this ethical frame of mind first. This is in German sittliche Gesinnung. A frame of mind works for that. Sittliche, of course, is ethical. And remember that sittlich, in this case, is talking about something that's not just, embodied in intentions, but really sedimented into habits, into customs, into mores, into the ways in which we do things. This does not mean that everything is merely a repetition. There is still room for creativity and innovation and interpretation, but it takes place on the basis of that. Right? So that's key to keep in mind. Now, here in the first sentence of it, we want to be a little bit more attentive. Hegel talks, Miller translates this as acknowledgement, anerkennen. And this word's going to show up twice in this passage. And anerkennen, if you remember, is what self-consciousness has been seeking the entire time. Another word for it, recognition. So there's a recognition on the part of the human subject that is taking place of the ethical power. But the human person is also seeking recognition as well and not finding it in this case. They're not going to be able to provide it to themselves. What we get here as well in there is no longer any conflict between ethical purpose and actuality. The actual German here is that the Zweigespalt, the splitting apart into two things of ethical purpose, Zweck, and actuality, Wirklichkeit, has been aufgehobenen, right? This is Aufhebung at work, sublation, transcending, however you want to think about it, integration on a higher level. So there's been a progress here, a dialectical progress that's been taking place. It's not one that's actually visible from the side of the acting person, for whom they experience this in terms of guilt and action and anguish and conflict. But we, as the phenomenologists following along with this, can see that an Aufhebung has taken place through this section and is continuing to take place, really. So he says, this ethical frame of mind knows that nothing counts but right. We have a return to it. We saw this in previous paragraphs. This is different than acting ethically because you're motivated for some other end, like being healthy, wealthy, wise, Ben Franklin style, or looking impressive and getting power the way, for example, Deokis did in Herodotus's histories. This is a guy who actually he set himself up as a very fair judge in ancient city, and everybody started bringing their cases to him because he was so just, and then he used that to seize power. Right? We could go on and on and on. The ethical, if we're really acknowledging it as the ethical, we acknowledge that it takes top priority, and that means that if other things are going to distract us from the ethical or are going to come into conflict with it, we have to be ready to sacrifice those. And that is why somebody like Antigone is ready to sacrifice the laws of the city. It's not like she's just a malcontent who wants to say, screw you to all the laws or something like that, including her own family members. No, she feels that there is an overriding duty here that she has to satisfy. And so that is something that Hegel thinks really is key to the ethical. That it's the thing that we acknowledge, again, recognition playing a role, we acknowledge as having a higher priority. So what happens because of this? Hegel says the doer surrenders his character and the reality of his own self and has been ruined. Now, isn't that a strange reward for acting ethically? That you lose your own character, that you lose the reality of yourself, and that you are thereby ruined. Well, we saw this before, for example, in the Virtue and the Way of the World section. To really acknowledge something as a higher priority than one's own individuality is to take the risk of what is happening here, the loss of one's own character. Not a character in the sense of just simply moral character, but the sense of who one is. We might say personality. That is no longer essential. Antigone, if she's acting only because she's Antigone and that's the sort of thing she's going to do, like our modern day celebrities who are their own brands, would not be ethical. It's by acknowledging something higher than herself that she has to go along with, that she has the risk of getting that, losing that and getting it back. And here she's not going to get it back. Why? Because the other law, the ethical power that she originally opposed and said is not right, is not ethical, turns out to also be the ethical. So Hegel goes on and he says, this person's being consists in belonging to his ethical law as his substance. You align yourself totally, in Antigone's case, with the law of the family or the divine law. But in acknowledging, notice there's that term again, acknowledging, recognition, the other law, the opposite law, this one, the one that you began with, ceases to be for that person his substance. And instead of attaining actuality, it has become an unreality. Does this mean that one law has disappeared entirely? No. What it means is that there's a slippage, an unmooring. The law that was going to cover and protect and provide the meaning and ratification, the validation, you might say, for the person acting on its behalf turns out not to do that. What an experience this must be. One that some of us have had in our lives when you commit yourself wholly to a cause and you find out that the cause doesn't seem to have committed itself as wholly to you as an individual. You're still left with your individuality. Hegel says that what this person is left with is a kind of pathos. What does he mean here by pathos? A kind of suffering. That's the original term to it. And feelings. He also talks about disposition. You're left with your own being, your own personality, but you're no longer being covered by this ethical law, and you're now in conflict with this other ethical law. So he says the substance does appear in the individuality as his pathos, and the individuality appears as that which animates the substance and hence stands above it. So the individual is still fully conscious, but they're aware of a kind of slippage, a kind of non-coincidence between them and the ethical at this point. And, as Hegel is leaving in the background, the threat, the accusation, the guilt that is imposed by the other law, which turned out not to disappear at all, but to remain in full force. So he says the substance is a pathos that is at the same time his character. The ethical individuality is directly and intrinsically one with this, his universal aspect, exists in it alone, and is incapable of surviving the destruction of this ethical power by its opposite. Here Hegel talks about one ethical power destroying another. This is actually going to turn out to be mutual, as we'll see in the paragraphs yet to come. I mentioned that what is taking place here is what we might call a catastrophe of the ethical. Here Hegel is sketching out how this happens within the individual who took the ultimate risk and who seems to have bet on the wrong horse. Perhaps they should have gone to the other side, the other law. That remains to be seen. But at the same time, this individuality has the certainty that that individuality, whose pathos is this opposing power, suffers no more injury than it has inflicted. The movement of the ethical powers against each other and of the individualities calling them into life and action have attained their true end only insofar as both sides suffer the same destruction. For neither power has any advantage over the other that would make it a more essential moment of the substance. The equal essentiality of both and their indifferent existence alongside each other means that they are without a self. In the deed, they exist as beings with a self, but with a diverse self, and this contradicts the unity of the self and constitutes their unrighteous and necessary destruction. Character, likewise, in respect of its pathos or substance, in part belongs to one only, in part from the aspect of knowing, the one character like the other, is split up into a conscious and an unconscious part. And since each itself calls forth this opposition, and its not knowing is, through the deed, its own affair, each is responsible for the guilt which destroys it. The victory of one power in its character and the defeat of the other would thus be only the part and the incomplete work which irresistibly advances to the equilibrium of the two. Only in the downfall of both sides alike is absolute right accomplished, and the ethical substance as the negative power which engulfs both sides, that is, omnipotent and righteous destiny, steps on to the scene. Paragraph 472 is going to bring to a successful close this clash or conflict that has been taking place between the two ethical powers, or the laws, the human and the divine law, and the individuals, the acting individuals who are embodying and representing them as ethical individuals, as entirely committed to their side. And Hegel is going to talk about a mutual destruction of these two laws. That doesn't mean that they're going to completely go away, but what we could call their substantiality, their claim to universal validity, ends up being denied, and something else steps in their place. The ethical is revealed at this point as destiny, Schicksal, or fate, if you like. Absolute right is revealed as belonging to neither of the laws, and the ethical substance is revealed as the negative. How does this take place? Well, the entire thing that we've been tracing out over the last 3 paragraphs on the side of one representative turns out to be going on with both of them. So Hegel says this individuality has the certainty that the individuality whose pathos is this opposing power suffers no more injury than it has inflicted. They're both acting in such a way. So this would be Creon and Antigone, or this would be the 2 brothers that we're going to talk about in the next paragraph. And so Hegel tells us the movement of the ethical powers against each other and of the individualities, calling them into life and action, because you need individualities in order to make the ethical actual, have attained their true end only insofar as both sides suffer the same destruction. We have here something quite similar to what was going on in the self-consciousness section early on in the struggle for recognition and the struggle to the death, don't we? Now he goes on and he says, the equal essentiality of both and their indifferent existence alongside each other means that they're both without a self. Both of them are lacking something. Both of them have individualities who lack a substantial self, even though committed to their understanding of the ethical. So he says, in the deed, they exist as beings with a self, but with a diverse self. Hegel is saying that, he's not trying to say that we should all be one self or anything along those lines. He is saying that insofar as we're talking about the ethical, the self ought to be united. There shouldn't be any underlying or irresolvable conflicts there. And he says this contradicts the unity of the self and constitutes their unrighteousness and necessary destruction. Character, he says, likewise in part belongs to one only, in part from the aspect of knowing. The one character, like the other, is split up into a conscious and an unconscious part. Since each itself calls forth this opposition, and its not knowing is, through the deed, its own affair, each is responsible for the guilt which destroys it. So each one has taken onto itself the guilt that we have been looking at. Each one is acting, you might say, criminally in relation to the other law. None of them are able to subsume the ethical into themselves. The ethical does exist, however, and the ethical is what remains in their mutual destruction, or you might say, if we want to be a little less dramatic about it, their mutual invalidation. So he says, the victory of one power in its character, the defeat of the other, would thus be only the part and incomplete work which irresistibly advances to the equilibrium of the two. The equilibrium is to be found in something greater, something deeper. So he says the downfall of both sides is how absolute right is accomplished, vollbracht in German, fulfilled. The absolute right, the absolute, the ethical that we've been seeking is attained in both of these laws, finding their relativization, you might say, and the fact that they don't encompass the ethical as they thought that they did, and neither do the individuals who identify themselves with them. So he goes on and he finishes by saying, this is omnipotent and righteous destiny stepping on the scene. So that is where we're brought to by the actions of the individuals, not just any individuals, but individuals who have so totally aligned themselves with the ethical powers or the ethical laws that their deeds can indeed matter. But the mattering there turns out to be relativized to this absolute destiny.